So I think the first actually really official question we're actually supposed to talk about was what we find most surprising in the current campaign. And let me propose float a balloon of sorts and say that maybe one of the most surprising things is the proportion of people who've already voted. We're 1 week out from the election, and something like 50%, the mail-in ballots are, if you count them, are something like half of the level of the total turnout from 2016 already. I think I saw Montana, it was 75%. So in a couple states, the turnout is just early turnout through mail-in balloting or early voting is just really something that hasn't been seen before. Is this going to have an effect on our predictions in a sense, or on the election? What do you make of that?
We haven't really thought too much about it in the sense that we're predicting vote intention more than we are predicting turnout. So it is. I mean, it does. I agree that it is kind of surprising, and there was discussion about how hard it will be to vote because of the coronavirus, and so the idea that people are actually voting more because they're concerned about it. In the past, maybe they would have just put it off and not bother voting on election day. I agree. It is like behavior can be surprising in that way. In the United States, we have voter registration in most of the states. So a lot of people who would be otherwise eligible to vote can't vote because they haven't registered. So this doesn't resolve that issue.
Suppose if the turnout turns out to be well above what we saw in 2016 or earlier years, what does that mean? Is it if you have high turnout, is that an advantage for the Democrats? One would think that maybe the people least likely to turn out and vote might be poorer voters who are overburdened with other concerns. So if you see really high turnout, are these the marginal voters who are now actually voting? And would that actually be something that improves the Democrats' chances?
It's hard to know for this particular election because more Democrats, there are states where we know exactly who voted because it's public information. It's not, we have a secret ballot in the United States, but it's not secret whether you voted. And so we do have some states, and in those states, it's clear that more Democrats are voting early than Republican, but we don't know what that means, to what extent they're additional voters versus just time shifting. So there have been some surveys done of voters and people who voted so far and not, to try to assess that. But I think that's kind of in the bowels of these political campaigns, so I don't know the answer. People have been...
Independent of how they voted, if the turnout is, say, 10% higher than in the past elections, would that favor one party?
It depends who the 10% are. A few years ago, in the late 90s, some researchers did study combining a bunch of surveys looking at non-voters to try to assess what would happen if more people voted, if there was universal turnout. And there were two things. First, they said it wouldn't really make much of a difference. Why? Because their estimate was that if everybody voted, it would only shift things by about 3 percentage points toward the Democrats. Now, in the late 90s, well, yeah, but in the late 90s, there had been 5 straight non-close elections. In 1980, when Reagan beat Carter, 1984, when Reagan was reelected, 1988, when George H.W. Bush won, 1992 and 1996 when Bill Clinton won. These weren't all landslides, but none of them were extremely close. So in the late 90s, the statement was, oh, sure, it would shift about 3 percentage points of the vote, but it doesn't really matter much. 3 percentage points is pretty small. Since then, nearly every election, with the exception of 2008, I think every election since 2000 has been closer than those 5 previous elections. So in an era of very close elections, it can matter more. The other thing was, if everybody voted, I think it would change the issues that the candidates would run on, because non-voters have much more, they have different concerns than voters.
I think we might, tell me if I'm wrong, Alieza, but I think we have about 4 minutes left or so. So maybe I'll ask one more question. Is that okay?
That sounds great. Yeah, go ahead.
So talking about, maybe I'm stuck in the past, but talking about, 2016 versus now again, in a sense, the media really came under a lot of scrutiny for what was called often false equivalence in comparing, say, the issue with using a private email server that Hillary Clinton was doing, and comparing that with many, many, many scandals and frauds that Trump was involved in. And at the same time, there was a feeling, I think, Yochai Benkman had a kind of a famous paper that got a lot of attention in media circles, showing that in 2016, even some of the mainstream media picked up stories and was influenced in the topics they covered by kind of right-wing Breitbart kind of media. Is the media different this time through? Is there a lesson that they learned? There were estimates in 2016 about the amount of free exposure, even by places like CNN, that they gave to Trump by just covering lots of the outrageous things that he said. And some people had dollar estimates of how valuable that much time on air would be. Is there something different about the media in the way they're covering the election this time through, and will that matter?
I think so, but I would really only saying that as sort of a casual observer. I have not studied this. It does seem that the media, that the news media felt that they were played last time, and they're not playing the game this time. But again, I can't really say as a social scientist that I have anything to add on that. What I will say though is I think that the news media there's an asymmetry so between the two parties in the United States. I don't really know how it is in other countries, but there has been research about media bias. And my take on it is that the media bias on the left and the media bias on the right are different. And I won't really say which is worse, which is not a statement of false equivalence, but just a statement of difference. So my take on it is that the nonpartisan media is mostly occupied by people who are Democrats or sympathetic with the Democratic Party. And they do want to get that message into their reporting in a kind of indirect way, that not so much running a certain propaganda story, but kind of writing about things. So Trump is president, the Republicans in power, so they have kind of negative stories about the coronavirus. Perhaps if a Democrat were in power, they would just be trying to downplay it in some way. I think that there is some of that. On the other side, the right-wing media seems much more directly partisan and will run questionable stories and seems to me to be following the script much more. Now, as I said, you could argue either way. You could certainly argue that this is dangerous to have partisan media, or you could argue that the nonpartisan media, by being ideological in an indirect way, conservatives have argued that that has its own bias. I think part of the asymmetry is that the media, the news media, the press are in some vague sense part of the Democratic or liberal coalition. And if the Democrats are in power and they overstep their bounds in some way, the media will criticize them. And they have to be sensitive to that. The Democrats are somewhat constrained. There's been a lot of discussion of norm breaking. So the idea that the Republicans, with the Supreme Court judge is the most obvious case, but in other cases too, the Republicans, even if it wasn't just that they didn't vote to impeach, to convict Donald Trump, but that it seemed like they weren't even taking it seriously. Whereas when Clinton was president, the Democrats also didn't vote to convict him, but they took it more seriously. And I think part of that is that the Democrats, if they violate the norms, they will be criticized by the press. If Republicans violate the norms, they will be criticized too, but it doesn't matter. Their press sort of has no power over them, and they're kind of trying to move to a situation where their supporters don't care what's in the news at all. And I think that sort of asymmetry is hard to it goes beyond the usual way that people try to measure bias by which sources are being quoted on different sides.
One quick anecdote before I turn it over to Alieza. In some of these media circles, right, they've done research on this, both with text analysis, but also with surveys asking people what words come first to mind when you think of this candidate or that candidate. And what you often get with Hillary Clinton after the election, shortly after the election when they ran these studies, was email, scandal, foundation. Those were the three words most associated with Clinton. Where with Trump, it was mostly policy issues, immigration, crime, stuff like that. And so that speaks, in a sense, to at least a successful media message in forming kind of impressions about the candidates in 2016. My impression would be we don't see so much of that going on this time. There seems to be more of a traditional gatekeeping role for at least the mainstream media, in which they're not as influenced by, say, the New York Post story, or even the Wall Street Journal turned down an initial offering of a story, claiming about Hunter Biden. That's something that feels like probably is learning from what happened in 2016 and more of a gatekeeping role happening now by the media. It's partly anecdotal, but it does feel somewhat different this time through.
I agree. I do think it's different. And as I said, I think there is an asymmetry in the way that the media can constrain. I mean, an example would be if there's some court reform proposals by a hypothetical incoming Democratic administration, you can bet that the New York Times, well, they would think long and hard about whether to support it editorially, but they would certainly run articles by critics of it. They would run op-eds by critics of the proposal. They'd run discussions about why it couldn't be a good idea. You don't see that in the conservative media with regard to I don't think you're going to see a lot of like countervailing views. So that's why you get this asymmetric constraint. Although a conservative would say that it's balanced by the fact that the nonpartisan media kind of leans liberal.
Great.
Well, on that note, for listeners who are interested in this topic, this is like an ongoing topic of conversation amongst journalists right now. Just this week, the Neiman Journalism Lab released new polling on which voters are most likely to be influenced, for instance, by fake news, or to share that, how the role that journalists have to play in counteracting that. This was also listening to the New York Times discussion about how the election was falsely called in 2000 in Bush v. Gore, and the role that media had to play in that particular historical moment, and whether the media will play a similar role this year if it is a contested election. So if you are interested in learning more about that, please feel free to contact us after the panel. But I'm going to now turn to our panelist, Mariah Craven, for a short discussion of the social and economic sort of forces affecting the election this year. So just to start, Mark and Andrew alluded to this, but to say the least, the current sitting president is quite polarizing. We've certainly seen him embolden a type of white identity politics and strongman masculinity. So I'm wondering how you feel the president's behavior will impact voting behavior, both on the right to people that speaks to people that does not speak to, and how do we as a society move forward given that environment?
Oh my gosh, a big question. But so I'll say, like, full disclosure, I work for Democratic candidates and have worked for the last 4 years on efforts to make sure that Trump is not reelected. So I'm kind of coming at this from a very partisan point of view. I think that, what can I say about somebody who started out using some of the loudest dog whistles that we've probably ever seen in modern election history, and has moved to basically shouting the things that he's not supposed to be saying out loud. He was in Michigan and Wisconsin this weekend, two very important states in the upcoming election, and thinks that he's speaking to women voters, but is using language that is so out of tune with where we are in this time and place that, I don't see how this can be successful to, when you're speaking at a rally, to say to women and voters, I'm working hard to get your husbands back to work. I love women, maybe even more than men. These are all very strange ways of speaking to the electorate right now. But I think it also goes back to where he started, which is make America great again. He's referring to a time and place that we've left behind, but a very small group of people in this country would love to go back to that era where, I guess, men brought home the bacon and women stayed at home and waited for them to do whatever it was they were doing. So, I think that will continue. We saw in 2016. I think what we saw in 2016 was people who were uncomfortable with the Clintons, who wanted something different. Now they've had 4 years of it. I think that group of people has gotten much smaller, and he's still shouting very loudly to them. But I don't think it's going to work. And I think it's a bad move for a country that is changing so dramatically demographically. We have more non-white voters, more young voters, more women voters than ever before, I think. And, we're seeing that play out in places like Texas, which very well might become a purple state for this election. 3 counties in Texas this weekend saw early voter turnout that was higher than what they saw in all of their voter turnout in 2016. And with that turnout and the changing demographics, we're anticipating that, in the next 4 to 8 years, Texas will start looking very blue. And this year it might even look purple. So.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Texas. I was reading this morning that Texas Supreme Court just ruled that Harris County, which is the Houston metro area, the 4th largest metro area in the country, home to 4.7 million residents, has decided to only place 1 ballot box for mail-in ballots. We also saw, when you're in the LA area, the California Republican Party planted fake ballot boxes in 4 counties. The state has sent a cease and desist that the party has ignored. So I'm wondering how you think that methods such as these will impact the results. It seems like maybe the voter turnout might overwhelm efforts, but I'm curious what your take is.
This year, I think that things are being tested out that aren't really going to work. So, for example, the fake ballot boxes here in California. So this year, for this election, every California voter, every active registered California voter received a ballot by mail. And you can return that in a number of ways, but one way is official drop boxes. They're these big yellow drop boxes that you can't miss. The Republican Party locally put up basically filing cabinets that had a little slot at the top that you could stick your ballot in, and printed out a sign that said, official ballot drop box. I don't know how many people use those. I don't think very many people did. But what is happening is now they're setting up this idea that, this was allowed to happen, so the results might not be trustworthy. So I think that's what we're going to see this year is maybe some attempts to tamper with votes. But what it really is doing is sowing a lack of confidence in the results of the election. And I think that's what Trump is really doing with a lot of his remarks and his tweeting. He obviously is not suppressing the vote, but what he's doing is making people question. And we're already hearing people start to say, well, if Biden wins, it's only going to be because the Democrats cheated so badly. And then that sets us up for people co-signing this idea that he's presented that, he might not leave office, depending on, if he doesn't trust the results of the election.
Yeah. Well, I think that we had a question from the group, why aren't we more outraged? I absolutely am outraged all the time. So, if there are any doubts as to the tenor of my intro, I think, this has been an alarming 4 years. I think I have a couple brief more questions, and then we're going to turn it to the Q&A. So I guess first, you brought up this question of sowing mistrust in the process. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the possibility of the president contesting the election results, or what a constitutional showdown might look like, at least from the perspective of Democratic Party members who may have to fight that in the coming days.
And I also want to respond to the question about outrage. So outraged. I've been working for 4 years. It's exhausting, and I've been working weekends and nights and marching, and so I think after 4 years, maybe it doesn't. It's hard to be surprised by what's happening anymore, because we've been trained to expect the worst, and maybe that's a bad place to come from. But right now, everybody's kind of like thousands of people dug in, just trying to finish out the next 5 days, and then think about what happens next, which is going to be about protecting. We have to vote, get out the vote, protect the vote, and then protect the results. And so I think if we don't have a landslide situation where it's very obvious, not only with the popular vote, but with the Electoral College, that yes, we have a winner and it's clear, and we're not waiting weeks and weeks for more ballots to be counted, that's where we have the best shot at a peaceful transition of power, if there is one. If it's very close, or there are a lot of states that don't start counting mail-in ballots until Election Day or later, then we might have to wait weeks. And that's where things, I think, are going to get very tricky. And again, I'm pretty certain, and there are already people gearing up in case this happens, if we don't have results pretty quickly, that this will become a long, drawn-out process, even more so than how it was in 2000. And so there are attorneys, volunteers, nonprofits that are all already mobilizing in case that happens.
Yeah.
Alieza, can I ask Mariah a question? Would that be okay?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
So Mariah, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what the Democrats are doing with the get out the vote operations? You hear a lot about what the Republicans are doing. They claim they've got this big ground game. But I was wondering, in a sense, given that so many Democrats, have already cast their ballots through the postal system, does that make it easier to get out the vote? Because you could focus on a smaller group of remaining Democrats who have not yet voted. Is that an advantage to the Democrats? And what are the Democrats doing to get people to the polls?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think enough people have voted that it makes things easier. But in a normal year, what would be happening if there was no pandemic and we could all be seeing each other in person, is you would have armies of volunteer and paid staffers out knocking on doors, showing up at every concert, at every event, not only registering last minute voters, but making sure people have the information they need to get to the polls, or they have support and help getting their mail-in ballots in. What we have this year is, because so many communities are still having some sort of stay-at-home order or limiting how people can move about in public, and because there was a lot of discussion early on, we have volunteers who are ready to go out and knock on doors, but what if they scare the people answering the door? So we want to be very careful about that. So there is some door knocking happening with Democrats, but a lot of text banking. So volunteers sitting around texting as many people as they can, and a lot of phone banking. So this year and this Sunday in Texas alone, Democratic volunteers made over 1 million phone calls. So, I think voters are probably texted and phone called and emailed out at this point. And what we always tell them is vote early, because once you vote early, we will stop calling you. Once the voter file shows that you have voted, it's no longer a good use of our time and resources to call you. So vote as early as you can. You'll stop getting those calls and texts. What we saw here in California in the primary was that actually in a special election that we did in May, so after stay-at-home orders happened, this was the first test of an all mail-in ballot election that we had here. We saw Republicans vote very early, and they won that special election. So I don't know that, like, Democrats like to wait until election day and all go to the polls together and have that communal feeling. So it remains to be seen if we're going to stick to are the habits that we formed this year.
Yeah, so I think that I sort of one last comment from me before my final question for Mariah. I think that regardless of what the outcome of the election is, the United States, I mean, I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, but the first snows have already come to the United States. We're seeing unprecedented unemployment and poverty. So whoever is in charge after the election will have a very big job once they arrive. So certainly human need right now in the U.S. is at a all-time high, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. So it makes this election all the more important. But on a final note with Mariah, before we do sort of a lightning round and with the Q&A, I'm wondering what Senate, House, state, or local elections you're watching, and if there's something in particular you sort of want to point to that Hertie students and alumni keep an eye on in the coming week.
Sure. I mean, obviously, whenever there's a presidential election, that sucks all of the air out of all the political discussions. And so obviously we're looking at Pennsylvania in particular this year, and of course, Michigan and Wisconsin. But, further down the ballot, this is a very important year in the United States because, some polls are showing that Democrats might have an opportunity to flip the Senate. So, take back the Senate and turn that Democratic, which would be huge when it comes to actually getting, laws passed. We flipped the House of Representatives a couple of years ago. As a result, we saw the president was impeached because of that. We saw a lot of laws that passed the House, but then they got stuck in the Senate. And so, until we have the Senate, that's all just as important as having the White House at this point. We also had our census this year because we have this redistricting coming up. And depending on what state, Alieza mentioned, feeling like a disenfranchised voter because she's in a district that's so gerrymandered that, she doesn't have any problem with her vote. Yeah. In Utah. And Washington, D.C., both, or Puerto Rico, any of those. Yeah. So yeah. A lot of states, particularly Republican-led states, are gerrymandered so badly that Republicans, even though they might be the minority in that state, wield a tremendous amount of power. And so in many states, it's the state legislature, so down ballot races. And the representatives that come out of those that determine what people's representation is going to be for the next 10 years. So we're looking at Senate races in Maine, Florida, Georgia. We're looking at redistricting in the South in particular, in places like the Carolinas and Texas. And so I work with an organization called Swing Left that has a super state strategy. So there's a number of states where the presidential election, Senate races, and state legislature are all up for grabs. And that's where a lot of volunteers and activists are focusing. So no matter what happens with the race for president, we still maintain some sort of power, either in our states or in the Senate.
Could I say one thing?
Sure, go ahead,
Okay.
Andrew.
So it's one reason that the Republicans won the Senate maintained control of the Senate in 2016, which has, of course, been the cause of a lot of our recent constitutional crises, is that voters thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And there are some moderate voters in the United States, believe it or not, who want a balance between the parties. And many of them decided that since Hillary was going to win, they better balance things by voting for a Republican in the Senate. And then we got unified Republican control of government. Now, this election, it's actually kind of the opposite. So the experts, not just me, think that Biden is very well situated to win the election. He's the overwhelming favorite. He could lose, but he's the very strong favorite. But in polls, ordinary people think Trump has a really good chance of being reelected, and so those swing voters and ticket splitters will not necessarily want to balance Biden with a Republican. They might actually want to balance Trump with a Democrat. So the fact that Trump is considered to have a chance by a lot of ordinary voters could actually hurt the Republicans in the Senate. And in general, the research seems to show that people vote for president based on job performance, especially the economy, whereas people vote for Congress often based on trying to balance the government. And that's one reason why we expect that if the Democrats regain unified control of two of the three branches of government, we might expect that in 2022 that they could lose a lot.
So I'm going to move us over into the Q&A now. We've had a question come in from William, a fellow alum of mine in the Dominican Republic. And he would like to know, Mariah, if you were in the shoes of a Republican counterpart in that position, what would be some positive signs that you would look for on the other side of the aisle? And to Mark and Andrew, we also have a question from Sebastian about, the Washington Post recently released their source code for election night modeling. Can you speak to sort of the impact and downstream effects of publishing models like that in the name of transparency? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, encouraging me to put myself in someone else's shoes. We probably don't do that enough, and we're so even for me, it's like uncomfortably partisan these days. I just honestly I can't look at the world around me and imagine somebody voting for somebody who's so tone deaf. I think that what I would look for is for Donald Trump to keep his mouth shut, to be honest with you. I think every time he has one of these rallies, yes, he's mobilizing great numbers of people to the rally, but he's, so clearly lying and, talking about things that are so out of sync with how the rest of the country seems to be feeling, both in polling and in action, I think the best thing for them that I would be looking for is that as far as what I would be looking for from the voters that I'm talking to, I would be looking for voters who, for them, the economy is the most important issue, and they're really concerned about their taxes. And I think that, what this will come down to for a lot of people is they'll have to weigh, is my family's economic well-being, if my family is economically viable at this point, which a lot aren't, is that more important than all of the other things that are happening in this country, the ways that people are treated? We're on the precipice of potentially transforming how we treat people and really getting racial and gender justice for people. If we're standing on that precipice, you have to ask yourself, can I ask all of those people to wait a little while longer, since our economy was doing so well pre-pandemic, or is it their time now? And that's a hard. I get that that's a hard position for a lot of voters to be in.
Yeah, agreed. I have two comments. One regarding, well, is Trump campaigning in a kind of weird way? What's up with that? Or for that matter, what's up with Joe Biden? Why doesn't he do this or this and that, which seems so natural? Like, that's what I would do. There's a couple things you should remember. Most obvious thing is that most voters aren't like you. It's not even that. Like, the task of the campaign is to persuade voters to turn out and vote, to some extent to dissuade voters of the other side from voting, and to persuade people. And you have to figure out where people like you fit into this. So if you're already, most voters are not persuadable. The job of the campaign tactic is not to persuade persuadable voters. So you got to remember that. The other thing is that these people are professionals, but this is not like a professional soccer player who plays hundreds of games, or a coach who knows like which defenses work and which don't. There aren't that many elections. We at The Economist, we're making 50 forecasts, but it's one election. They could easily all be off in the same direction. So what do candidates do? Politicians do what they did before. A politician is someone who, presidential candidate, has climbed up the greasy pole often by not doing what people said he should do. They have their own path and it's worked for them, so they're probably going to keep doing it. They have the view, correct or not, that their success is in large part due to their personal choices. So sure, candidates can make bad decisions, because again, they're kind of, I think, typically doing what worked for them in the past. The other question is, why do we make our code public? Just more eyes on the street. The hive mind can find bugs in our code, find problems, and it happens. So if you put your stuff out there, then you can. I think it's also like we've struggled a lot with how to improve our model and how to diagnose problems with our model. If the code is public, it's easier for me to find my code. Like it's not just for everybody else. It's the same way that if you're writing an internal report for your organization, you still want to make it look nice. Not just because you're trying to impress people, but a report that looks nice. Look nice means it's readable, it focuses on the right points, and so forth. So really, making code public is part of the concept of publication, and there's a reason why you sometimes publish things, because if you just scroll them down, it's easier to make mistakes.
I should probably say on that also that it's very common to publish your code. Most people do that. The notable exception is Nate Silver in 538, in which people can kind of infer what they're doing, but they actually don't make the code itself available. They've had a lot of flack about that, and they question why, because people can try to simulate it and get kind of the same results as them, but you never know exactly what they did. And kind of intellectually, in a way, it's nice to have kind of a model and test it on multiple elections, but what people do is often that they want to tinker with their code every single election. So then they don't really have this out of sample prediction. If you go back and say, let's take my model and predict it as if we didn't know what happened on these different elections. But not so many people have like one model and test it over time and time and time and time.
You can't. Yeah, there's no out of sample prediction. Again, you're just going to want to keep changing the model. Circumstances change. If someone doesn't release, people don't have a moral obligation to release their code. It's their business decision what to do, right? So like if
contrary to the norms of academia, I mean, he's not an academic, right? But it's still kind of an intellectual enterprise, right? So
most academics, I don't think, make their code public either. It's mostly not because it's a secret, but because it's more work. I do think there are different attitudes. I mean, I don't know. Like I really have the attitude that I just want my mistakes to be out there for everybody to see, because they're going to be discovered anyway. I want them to be discovered sooner. But a lot of people don't have that. I mean, there definitely are people who don't want to admit error, and it's like a different way of going about life.
Well, we appreciate your transparency. And as a final lightning round, be brief if you can, 3 rapid fire questions: prediction, who will win the election, 1 swing state to watch, and final electoral college numbers, if you want to answer any or all of them. Yeah, we can start with Mariah and then move on to Mark and Andrew. That'd be great.
I think that it's going to be Biden, and I think the state that I'm going to have my breath held the most about is Pennsylvania, and I have no idea what the electoral. No prediction there.
Fair enough. Mark and Andrew.
I think the polling has been for a long time really remarkably stable compared to many other elections. And so, less reason to think that it'll change radically suddenly now in the last less than a week until the election. And so based on that, even the state polling, you see that relative to Clinton 4 years ago, Biden is ahead of Trump by a larger margin than Clinton was. So things look quite good for Biden right now. And if there are no surprises, I said this 4 years ago. I think 11 days before the election, I was giving a talk and said, if there are no surprises, it looks very good for Clinton. And then on that same day, the Comey letter came out.
Yep.
But it seems like, if there is nothing big and radical that happens, that things look very good for Biden. And the state to watch, I'm very curious about Florida. Florida, it's nice that they're on the eastern seaboard, and so polling will close a little bit earlier, and that could be a deal breaker if the numbers come in. That could basically shut down Trump's chances if he loses Florida. He really needs to win Florida. After that, probably Pennsylvania is the next most interesting for me.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add beyond what the others said.
Well, we appreciate you joining today. We unfortunately need to wind down this discussion. So thank you to Andrew, Mariah, and Mark. The Hertie School will actually be hosting a post-election event on November 10th. We look forward to welcoming Marina Henke, Nicole Koenig, Peter Wittig, and Sudha David Wilp. And they will have a rousing post-election analysis of the 2020 U.S. election. We hope that you will join. But thank you so much for joining us today, and have a safe and happy day.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. It was a lot of fun.